There is regulation that is stifling, and that's the regulation we think of. But there is regulation that's empowering. And so we as leaders want to understand the difference between the two. First thing we want to regulate is our emotional response.
Welcome to Reedflections, a podcast on life, leadership, and learning. I am Art Calderon here with Reed Nyffeler. Reed is a seasoned podcaster, a published author, a CEO of a growing global franchising security company, a husband, a father, a local leader, and we've been talking about leadership, Reed, a lot about leadership. We started many episodes ago talking about why developing leaders, who you should develop, what capacities do they need, where in the organization can your leaders grow, finally, how you should develop leaders. And currently, we're talking about leadership that lasts. Leadership that lasts. Last podcast, we talked about create. Now we're talking about regulate. Regulation. That sounds a little confining. It sounds a little. Not fun. But it's important. It's an important part. Tell us why so many people maybe would lean away from regulations while you're saying no. It's an important part of leadership.
Yeah, as we'll learn in this podcast, of course, I am someone that leans away or initially leans away from regulation until I understand the value of regulation. And so, regulation is a way to really help understand the parameters. And I'll give you two examples of where that is obvious and the way we should really set our minds as we're thinking through this podcast. When I was growing up, if you were showering and your sibling was using the restroom right next to it, they would flush the toilet. And if you all know what happens next, you get freezing cold water, or in that case, super hot water, depending on where the tank is filling up. And ultimately, I'd be in the shower, they'd flush. I'm like, I'd either burn or freeze, depending on what was happening. And that still happens.
Yeah.
And so what changed? A regulator. And so what did it do? It regulated the temperature so that when your sibling is there using the restroom right next to you and they flush it, your temperature doesn't materially change in the shower. So in that case, regulation pulls in and gets you in the middle, right? You're not getting burned or freezing without regulation. And so that is a regulator. And so then with regard to a business example, our brand, I remember about 3 or 4 years ago, we had built our brand and we had blue and orange were our primary colors, but I had not clearly defined them. And so as I'm working with marketing agencies, they would push it one direction or another because there wasn't clearly defined parameters. And so then I went through this whole initiative to define the brand, and there was even Pantone colors with the colors that we're using, the way that our logo could be presented, and ultimately where and how it's communicated, even the visuals, the verbals, and all of it. And you'd think, oh, that would take all the creativity away from these marketers. They would just have too many parameters. They can't, you've eliminated all the paint colors I could have, and now I only can use these. Instead, it accelerated creativity. And I know that's, the next podcast, but accelerated. Why? Because they're like, now I don't have to worry about which paint colors I choose. I've got them. Now I can just make these super creative within it. And as I was going through that exercise, I realized I've regulated them in many ways. This is all you can do. And in fact, at the time when we're rebranding franchises, like, oh, that's so limiting. And then they're like, no, this is amazing.
And they ended up embracing it.
They wholly embraced it. And you would think, oh, there's more regulation coming from the franchisor. And instead, they embraced it. And as a result, and you can look at our financial results, we accelerated because of the regulation. And so there is regulation that is stifling, and that's the regulation we think of. But there is regulation that's empowering. And so we as leaders want to understand the difference between the two. Is the regulation empowering that'll accelerate, just like we're talking about with the brand and the elements that are there and the consistency associated, or is it regulation that'll stifle, right? And think of that as an exorbitant tax. And when we think of regulation, we think of that as a tax. And so now we walk in with that context to understand the balance between the two. We essentially want to be just like that water regulator, saying we don't want you to get burned. We want you to freeze to death. We want you to be somewhere in a comfortable area that you can control and survive.
Now, you talked a lot in our podcast about having some self-discipline, right? That's a very fundamental in your leadership instruction. Have some self-discipline. So talk about regulation, but talk about self-regulation and how that comes into play as a leader.
Right. I think as a leader, if there's an incident that happens in an organization, we want to create a law or a rule, right? And so
Kind of reactionary.
that's reactionary, right? In fact, I always say, every leader creates regulation to keep themselves in power, right? Essentially. And that's the trap. The first thing we want to regulate is our emotional response. If, for example, we think of something catastrophic where I go out and I go, create an accident in my car and it damages it and it, wastes my day and I scrape up against a trash compactor or something, right? That's super frustrating. And then let's say it's just terrible. This is the worst day, right? I scrape it up on both sides because I was too tight and I can't even get out of the car. So now I'm trapped, right? Nobody's injured and I'm trapped. And yet I've damaged my car, thousands of dollars in damage and all that other stuff, right? So now if that happened to you, what would be your emotional response, right? I mean, people would say, hey, I've had this car for, in your case, 25 years, and I just recently got it repainted and covered the rust spots that were pre-existing.
That'd be horrible.
So you're thinking of, I can't drive this for another 45 years. What am I going to do, right? I'm going to have to get it repaired, and it's not even worth the damage I just created. And so we'd have to look at that emotional response. In my case, I'm saying, wait a minute, my only choice in this circumstance, because I can't take the car back out of that, and is my attitude.
Right.
My emotional response. And so if I'm not regulated in that regard, I'll go there. I'll give an analogy, right? Or an example. Imagine, and there's a commercial that's like this, if you've seen it, a coach at the end of the game, right? It's an end of a football game, let's say, and the game is on the line. And he's like, oh, we just made huge mistakes. That's why we have to do this Hail Mary play. And you guys are such idiots. I told you the play, right? And you didn't run it. And we're going to lose. And now what am I going to say at the press conference? You know what I mean? Oh my gosh. And the players are like, coach, there's 35 seconds left and we're at the 20-yard line.
Inspire us somehow.
Yeah, say something other than that, right? And so you have to recognize as the leader, your answer and voice are amplified. So if you have an emotional response, that emotional response is amplified. If you have a disposition or a calm demeanor, that calm demeanor is amplified. And there may be some element of emotion, and they will then defer or come back to that median. And so that is why self-regulation is so critical, because we are then leading them by our response as to how they should respond. So if we focus on the problem and the solution, then they're going to focus on the problem and the solution. And that's what we should regulate. If we focus on our emotion and the effects of that action, the car damage and et cetera, instead of what is the, hey, I'm safe, everything's fine, cars can be replaced, right? In that same scenario. If we focus on the result or the way to provide that solution, then we've appropriately regulated self, and our organization will follow our self-regulation.
Yeah, self-regulation. I remember speaking of my older vehicle. I have this truck. I love the truck. It's 30 plus years old. Used to belong to my father. The kids drove it. Finally, I got it after the kids got their own vehicles, and I repainted it, and I put some new things on it, and I've invested in this prize-winning machine. And then my daughter backed it out of the garage and knocked the side mirror off, and didn't damage it. I mean, knocked it off. I got home and it was on the ground, and I'll be honest. Not a lot of self-regulation for me when I got home. I was like, how did you? Also, she's damaged every car we've ever owned. I don't know how. You can see my point. Not a lot of self-regulation there. But I was thinking about, we mentioned a little bit about how we did a rebrand. And I remember when you first came out with that idea, I have never seen so much horror from so many people talking about how this was a horrible idea, but you stuck by it and you said this was a good idea, not just for our individual franchise owners, but for the whole organization. But there was so much pushback about this idea of this change, yet no one's talking about it now. It's all done. Everybody thinks it's great, and no one's pushing back. Now, that's all forgotten because you did not respond emotionally to everybody else's emotion.
Yeah, and I think that is the leadership that lasts, right? Because I will say that I listened. I think that's critical, right? And I didn't respond in emotion, and I gave them time to marinate, right? And so I was instituting a change, just like we talked about create. And so I have to let the organization go through their ramifications because they may not self-regulate to the same degree that I do because it's new to them. I'd been thinking about that rebranding in that case for years. So I have to recognize, even though I had been thinking about it and I'd regulated my way through that iteration, they had not had that opportunity. So as a leader, we want to give them an appropriate area and time and place to, kind of walk through their emotions. And so we don't put them up on the stage right afterwards, right? That's not an appropriate way for them to communicate their emotions. We give them an opportunity in that moment, and here's how I help others self-regulate. Say, why don't you think about it? and then type me response, right? Because why do I specifically give that answer? One, I challenge them to think about it because they're giving an emotional response. Second, when we're typing it out, we're seeing our response. We're not just articulating our response, we're seeing our response. And then I say, then I can review it and send it forward. Then what am I going to do with that response? Because if we are giving an emotional response, we want it to be heard and then hopefully influence in the direction we're thinking. And so I tell them, why don't you write that down? I'm helping them self-regulate, send it to me. Then if it's meritorious to send forward, I will. And at which point then I'm giving them an opportunity to self-regulate, and I'm not getting, and that they're feeling heard because I said, please send that to me, directly to me. Second, I will reply when you send it. At third, then you will hear my reply in association with your thoughts.
Now, here at Signal, the company that you founded, what's it been, 15 years
17.
ago? 17 years ago. We have to deal with a lot of regulations because we're a global company. We're all over. We're in nearly every state. We're in 48 states. 49 states. So each state has its own regulations. Talk a little bit about the regulations that we have to help our leadership navigate.
Yeah, we're in the security field. And so I believe 41 states have some form of licensure around the security officer or the entity. And, as I was reviewing that, and I look at them, they're not the same. And think of it this way, like a driver's license. If you've ever looked at any other state's driver's license, they're different. I'm like, it's literally a driver's license. You can get some when you're 16. You can get, in Nebraska, there's a school permit. You can get it at 14. Some you have to wait till you're 16 and a half. And then the pictures are oriented different and the information is largely the same. However, it's formatted all entirely different and the background and all these things are different. So there is state regulation, but not consistency. Yet, when we get our passports as part of the country we're in, that's all the same. And so that's an example of regulation on a small scale and a large scale. And so the state licensure is regulated similar to a driver's license, right? And so ultimately, in each of those instances, you're there. And so many people are like, I got to wait to get my license. However, it creates opportunity because then you have some relative balance of who you're competing against. Why is that relevant as a business owner in our case? Because if you have no regulation, you can get easily people that will undercut it, et cetera, and your price as a business owner would drop. Conversely, as a customer, you can have people that don't have appropriate liability insurance or have training protocols, and you can be liable for their inability to be regulated. And so that's the balance or benefit of regulation. But the other thing to watch, and I won't name the states, but certain states are doing it as a way to inhibit other competitors. So it closes the marketplace instead of having an open marketplace. So that's the other extreme. No regulation and, the wild, wild west, over-regulated, and no one can come in if they're not part of our inside group. So essentially, it's a kangaroo court. And so those are the two extremes. So in the middle is where you want to operate. Hey, we want some registration or licensure, but we don't want it to be oppressive, so we only keep our insiders in or pay-to-play scenarios. And so that's the difference of regulation specifically in our industry.
So what does that look like when a leader is regulating himself or herself well and the company well? What is that sweet spot?
So when you look at regulation, you want to look at two things: what is fixed and what is flexible. And those are the two things. So the fixed you want to have is universally regulated. And the flexible, you give the autonomy to that, help them make the best decision, right? And so what is fixed with regard to our brand? We always want to be represented as Signal, and our image and likeness is utilized across the globe, and we register those trademarks, we send those images, etc. Then how they're delivered may vary from place to place, right? We're in here in Omaha, Nebraska, and even as we have a Western Nebraska franchisee, they're really small communities. And our primary model is around patrol. And so we have a patrol vehicle driving. However, if you go to small communities of 500 to 1,000 people, patrol is not necessarily going to be the primary mode of service. And so we have somebody physically there, and there's an extension of that. So that's flexible, leaving that up to the entrepreneur and the owner to say, hey, what service offerings are the most relevant or available? And so I had that first experience with a franchise brand when I was with McDonald's. Or I was traveling and I went to McDonald's. So here in America, we have McDonald's, and it's something that I know it's a brand that I understand, and it's good, and I love their Egg McMuffin, right? It was invented by a franchisee, right? And so they added breakfast and they make McMuffins there. So then here I am. I was traveling for one of the first times to China, and I'm in China, and I don't speak Mandarin, and I
What?
can't read the menu, and nor did the person, the attendant, understand English.
Oh, wow.
So then I'm like, what do I recognize on the menu? And I'm like, hey, I need some protein. I'm American. We have different, they have rice milk, we have regular milk. So I'm like, okay, what do I recognize? I'm going to McDonald's. So I go to McDonald's and I point at the Egg McMuffin.
So they had a picture.
They had a picture,
Okay, good,
and it's
good.
fixed. It has to be on the menu, right? It has to be on the menu. And between 2 or 3 of them, they interpreted what I was trying to point at. And then the woman looks at me, she shakes her head no.
Oh.
And I was like, yes, I'm American. I want that. I am American. I want that. She's
Maybe
like,
it was after 10:30.
no, it was the appropriate time. It was in the morning. I was at
Okay.
the airport. And she's shaking her head no again. And I'm like, yes. And she shrugs her shoulder, which I guess is a universal sign. It's your choice, dude. And so I said, okay. And so then here we are, and they had all sorts of other menus, localized things that are probably more traditional Chinese breakfasts, or on menu items. But they did have their burger and they had their Egg McMuffin. And so then I get my thing. I'm like, oh, I'm so excited. I get to have this Egg McMuffin. And it was the only thing that was, what I thought was a McDonald's menu item. And so sure enough, I get this Egg McMuffin and I about spit it out.
Oh, no.
Because in America, we are cooking that egg and or the English muffin in vegetable oil or some sort of vegetable oil typically, whereas they had fish oil. So if you've ever eaten an Egg McMuffin with fish oil that was cooked in, it is not the same as an Egg McMuffin in America. And so that is an example of fixed, meaning they had the Egg McMuffin on their menu, but flexible, meaning they don't need a lot of eggs, and they cook everything in fish oil, and that's the predominant oil. They weren't going to change out their vats or their cooking methods to change it to fish oil.
And so corporate allowed that flexibility so that they can be regional.
Right, and viable, right, to the appetite of the prevailing people that were there.
Which are not you.
Which was not me, right? I looked around. In fact, candidly, they thought I was a giant. And I'm like, well, I'm like 5'11", and I'm not a giant. So I looked around, and there was not a whole bunch of people that, necessarily were my profile of breakfast eaters in that area.
Freedoms. You talk about how regulation brings some freedoms, right? Because here's the parameters, right? But you can be free within those. You can adjust. But that can also be abused, right, in the workplace. Some people take advantage of that. So how do leaders protect their followers from that sort of abuse?
Yeah, we want to create regulation that allows for freedoms, right? It allows for safety and security and assurity, right? It doesn't take over control, but it gives a level of expectation, right? And so an example of that is imagine, and this is really what the Romans did back to kind of the Romans, they created the Roman roads, right? Before, people just take the fastest direction or the one they knew or the path that was otherwise there, and it wasn't necessarily direct. And so then they started creating these roads, and then the wheels were on there, et cetera, and now you could see the transportation, and people began to move much more freely. Now, you would say, well, that's regulation. I'm mandated to go on this particular road, right, and go that direction, and that's a regulation. However, it also can accelerate society with regulation, so you need to balance that out. So one of the regulations, right, which actually in America is our first really civil right, which is the freedom of speech. And so that is a regulation. But it is a regulation within parameters to say, hey, we will not censor your speech, but we need to self-regulate and understand that there are appropriate speeches in the circumstance. So candidly, we have the freedom of speech. In America, we should not have anything we say or do be stifled. We have to be able to communicate it. However, that does not require anybody to accept what you're saying. And that doesn't mean that whatever you're saying isn't offensive. And so that is a measure of self-regulation, right? And so we can communicate, but then we should also be humans in that regard. And so that's a good example of it as a leader to say, okay, I'm going to put parameters, but at the same time there's accountability that comes with just being a human and saying what's appropriate or fair, right? And so there's certainly things as a leader that I have the right to say because I have the freedom of speech, but are completely inappropriate, and they're not outside of the rights, but they are inappropriate to foster and build relationships. And so that is an example of what that is. And so we want to give regulation in an organization that does 3 things: that permits, promotes, and protects. And so first, it permits this to be there. You promote the values, the organizational direction, and ultimately things that have leadership that last. But it also protects those who may not be in an ability to protect themselves, right? So again, an example of that. There's a regulation in America that if you are driving in a car, you have to have a seatbelt, one. And then two, if you're a child under a certain age, you have to be in a car seat. That's a regulation. Why? Because it permits someone to transfer back and forth. We don't know what other things. It promotes the travel, but at the same time, it protects the infant that cannot protect itself, right? Because that's there. So that is a regulation, but it's designed for the progression of society by safety measures, so that there's nothing there. And I remember hearing stories that does your car have seatbelts? They invented seatbelts in it.
We just put some ropes.
Okay, ropes.
Yeah.
Okay, and people are like, no, I'm safe. I don't need a seatbelt.
Yeah.
And that was a big push and fight because it was regulation. But now people don't think twice about it, and it just becomes part of the culture. And they recognize how many lives are saved as a result of that,
Right.
and then ultimately how cars are
And nobody
improved.
pushes back on that anymore.
They don't push back on that. No.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, now what happens when an organization does not have any sort of regulation, or at least not sufficient regulation? What happens to an organization? What does it look like?
Well, then there's really no direction. I had this opportunity, and it gave me a ton of insight on how this worked. I had this opportunity to go to Salt Lake City area, and there's Park Cities there, and there was this, maybe I think it was it's the largest privately owned land that does not have any. You can't have any motorized vehicles on it. So it's right outside of Park City, about 10 miles outside of Park City. It's a very mountainous region, and you have to either traverse it by foot or by horseback or something else. And as I was there, they were telling me the history of it all. And a gentleman, and I don't recall his name, but in the early 1800s, he had walked there, and he's a topographer. So he wrote all the mountain heights. He wrote all the things that were otherwise there. He went all the way back up to Washington, D.C., and he said, hey, there's this land out west. It wasn't a state yet, or maybe it was just, I don't believe it was a state. Utah was not a state yet. And he said, I've mapped all this land. And the time the president's like, you were in that area? And yeah, it was freezing cold. How long were you there? 6, 9, 12 months. And I'm mapping all these areas by foot. Yeah, I mean, amazing. And he said, I would like to, use this for you to develop the land. And he said, okay, wow, what is your fee? And he said, I'm so impressed by your quality of your topography. I will give you the first choice of land. And he circled that area, which was the same private family owned area in that area. And then from there, that regulation, that definition of the land that he defined became the defined land of the state. And then ultimately what we now know as counties, and ultimately now what we know as cities. And that then propelled the development of the West, because there was a visualization and a definition of what was available. Now with regulation, you have a form of protection. And so our government, National Guard, protects our land if we own it, in a much more broader sense, maybe not our property, that might be the local police, but there is rights associated with that regulation that are to the benefit of society.
And that brings us to the end of our time. Regulation. Thank you very much, Reed. It's important to remember that regulation, when done properly, is beneficial to individuals and to organizations. Thank you also, listeners, for your time. We appreciate you. Now, next time when we come together in episode 26, we're going to talk about accelerate. Moving forward, which I know you like to do. Moving forward. Very good. In the meantime, I'm Art Calderon. Stay purposeful.
And here we are at the last word. And many times as we start, we think regulation, that's got to be a problem. However, you cannot regulate an organization if you've not regulated yourself. I challenge all of you, if you have an emotional response to circumstances that are outside of your control, look inside and say, how can I learn to self-regulate? That is imperative as you begin to lead organizations and try to create a leadership that lasts, because the organization will respond in an amplification of what you respond to. However, if you have self-regulation and you are able to put in parameters that are able to permit and protect and progress, you will then accelerate. And that is what we'll discuss next time. So focus on self-regulation, and then you can begin acceleration.